We all have our demons.
Not enough pain.
What's up, guys? This is Kaylriene, aka Chugmug, aka Saladolin, aka Video Babo XE, aka Video Babo, aka Bobby D. How's it going? I'm here today to talk about something critically important and something that is close to my heart, and that is a problem that a lot of new MMO players face when they first think about trying the role of tanking, and that is Tanxiety. You might have heard of it, you might have had it, you might have overcome it. We're here to gather together in a support group today and talk about the problem and how you ultimately conquer it. So tanking generally is a role that gets a lot of shit from people and has this high barrier to entry that people put on it because it is a role that tends to, in a lot of sort of pickup groups and informal groupings of players, it tends to be the leader. That's not necessarily by design or fully intended, but it's the way it often works out in a lot of groups. You're expected as the tank to lead everyone through the dungeon. And if it's your own first time in the dungeon, this kind of sucks. Doesn't feel great. A lot of people get nervous about that. In a raid setting, this tends to also be the case, but in a different way. You are probably, most likely, in a raid group where the tank may not be the de facto leader, like the person on voice comms giving out the actual raid strats or kill orders or anything of that sort, but a tank still has a strong role to play in the gameplay and pacing of a raid group. You'll do that through the way that you play your class. You'll do that through the way that you tank the dungeon. You'll do that through how you pull mobs and how you group up everything to be killed by your DPS. So it creates a lot of anxiety in people for that very reason, because it's often kind of looked at as this difficult, obscure thing to do. Nobody wants to be the group leader unless they really signed up for it. But often as a tank, a lot of people in pickup groups will expect you to just lead the group. And that's pretty difficult for a lot of people to do well. So getting over being tankious requires a few different things. Starting with the basic understanding of tank gameplay. And this applies to any MMO that has tanks. I haven't tanked in Final Fantasy XIV, so while I do talk about 14 on this channel, I'm not really going to get into it on this video. Because I just haven't done it enough in Final Fantasy XIV to really be of any use there. But in World of Warcraft, tanking mechanics basically require a few different things. You have to understand how your class plays. You have to understand what your mitigation abilities and your damage reductions are. You have to understand what your self-sustain looks like. And then you have to understand your oh shit buttons and how you sort of overcome a disaster. Because there are situations that every encounter designer will try to work in that are disasters. They'll basically try to make you shit your pants and run away. And your job as a good tank is to not run away. In Legion for World of Warcraft, and this seems like it'll be continuing into Battle for Azeroth as well based on what we got to play at BlizzCon, active mitigation is still the name of the game for tanks. What that generally means is that most bosses will have one or two abilities that will test your ability to mitigate damage. They're heavily telegraphed, they'll let you know they're coming, and your job when that happens is to pop your active mitigation ability and stand tall in the face of that damage. For me, example right here is a Vengeance Demon Hunter. My core active mitigation ability is Demon Spikes. A lot of tanks have a very similar ability that's based on a charges system, where you'll often have multiple charges of the ability. The normal suggestion for most classes is that you're going to do what's called rolling one charge. That is, you'll always have one charge on cooldown, with the goal being to reduce your normal damage intake during the rest of the dungeon, but you'll always want one charge on reserve for any so-called tank buster, any of those mitigation checks where a boss will make sure that you have active mitigation up and running. Active mitigation normally has a resource cost tied to it, so it's important to know what that is for your class and to understand how to get there as fast as possible. If you know that something is coming up that's going to require you using your active mitigation, you then need to make sure you have that in the bank. Currently in Legion for Demon Hunters, Demon Spikes requires 20 pain. I generate pain from use of my Shear ability, and I also generate pain from taking damage equivalent to a certain percentage of my base health. It's hard to predict how you're going to gain damage based, or how you're going to gain pain rather, based on damage received, so it's generally easier to think about in terms of shears. A shear generates 10 pain. I need to shear twice to be able to Demon Spikes. I can shear, and then it has global cooldown, so I can shear in about 3 seconds, enough times for me to then pop a Demon Spikes. That's a good basic level of understanding to have. It is worth noting here in Battle for Azeroth that is going to change for Demon Hunters specifically to 25 pain, so it's going to become this weird number that kind of sucks now. Other than that, the mechanics aren't really going to change. And depending on your class, a lot of it may be very different. Paladins, for example, have Shield of the Righteous, which has a charge system that's unique to it and no resource cost. So it basically, you just use the charges for the ability rather than using any external resource like mana or holy power as it used to be. Some other classes have very different mechanics. Blood Death Knights are probably still the most unique tanks in the game in that their active mitigation is using their healing ability, and then it puts a buff on them that allows them to mitigate damage for a few seconds to pass those checks. It's because they don't have a more traditional model of active mitigation that increases armor or reduces physical damage taken. So understanding mitigation is the #1 key thing for any new tank. Before you start looking at any other mechanics or any other modes of gameplay as a tank, you need to really know what your abilities are, how you use them, and when to use them. So active mitigation is the easiest place to start because it's the thing that you'll use the most. Dungeons, raids, and even PvP situations against other players, if you decide to PvP as a tank, will all have situations where your active mitigation becomes valuable and useful. So learn it, love it, use it. For every tank, it's usually one ability. So it's a really easy thing to remember. You just have to know when you pick up a new tank spec, what's the ability for active mitigation? How can I press it? What's its resource cost? The other component to learning active mitigation is learning what a tank buster is. In WoW, that's really easy to do. I can look at my dungeon journal and look at the boss overview, and it'll tell me right here, use active mitigation when Dark Strikes is active on this upcoming boss. So when he uses Dark Strikes and the DBM notification goes off when he emotes it, I need to make sure my Demon Spikes is up at that point in order to reduce that incoming damage. Normally a tank buster will usually be a cast time type ability or something that has a big wind up, so you'll have ample opportunity to deflect it. You'll need to learn what your tolerance is for when to press it in terms of your computer performance, your internet connectivity. A lot of things can factor into it. But generally, the abilities all have a long enough window that it's not really that sensitive. Demon Spikes for me, for example, lasts for 6 seconds. 6 seconds isn't a whole lot of time, but unless I have a ridiculous lag spike and I try to press it last minute, I can press it as soon as I know the ability is about to come in, and I'm going to be okay. So you just have to learn when a tank buster is going to cast, how long it takes, and be ready with active mitigation. Generally, DBM alerts and other things within the game, like if Blizzard builds in any boss emotes, are already built to tell you as soon as the ability is going to cast, and usually the warning that it's casting at all is your cue to pop active mitigation and go to town.
It's so good to fight again.
The next thing you'll really want to start learning is your path through a dungeon. Here's the Dark Strikes warning, actually is a good example. So the path through a dungeon is often the part of tanking that gives a lot of people the worst anxiety, because it's kind of tricky to learn, and there's a lot of finesse that can be done in terms of how you play through a dungeon. The best tanks are the ones that know all the shortcuts, that know all the ways to skip trash, but you're not going to be that right away. And I think that's the thing that's important that a lot of tanks miss out on, and that gives them overwhelming anxiety. You have to know that generally, if you don't know the absolute best route through a dungeon, that's okay. Everybody has to learn it at some point, and especially coming up here with Battle for Azeroth when that launches next year, you'll have an ample opportunity to learn it alongside everybody else. You might have somebody who played an alpha or beta who gets really weird and shitty with you in chat about it, but at the end of the day, everybody's going to be learning the dungeons, and most people are not strong-willed enough to be a tank and to actually put that knowledge to work. So if some DPS criticizes you for not knowing the right route, that's not great, but that's fine. At the end of the day, you're the one brave enough to tank, and they're not. So if they want to helpfully provide that information, that's great. But if they're going to be shitty with you about it, don't worry about it. Everyone has to learn sometime. Also, learn to pull slowly at first. It's really important when you're first learning how to tank to know what your limit is in terms of the damage that you'll be receiving and your own self-sustain. Self-sustain refers to your ability to heal yourself up. Currently in Legion, every tank has some form of self-sustain, whether it's a castable heal or some other kind of ability. It's important to make sure you know what that ability is. For Demon Hunters, for example, I have Soul Cleave as my base intended self-sustain ability. It uses the soul fragments I generate from Shear to heal me and also to deal some damage. So it's a pretty great ability, but I need to know when to use it. So all of the abilities that are self-sustaining for tanks have some sort of quirk to them that affects their usage. For Demon Hunters with Soul Cleave, its healing is actually based on two different factors. It's based on the number of soul fragments it can consume, up to a maximum of 5, and it's based on the amount of pain that you spend to cast the ability. You can cast it at 30 pain, up to 60 pain, and it does more healing the more pain that is invested in when you cast it.
Thank you for your help.
So knowing that is critical. Every tank has some sort of self-sustain. I will pre-warn you not to overwhelm with this information, but in Battle for Azeroth that does currently appear to be changing for most tanks, in that the intent is that healers will be much more actively involved in tank survivability, and so a lot of tank classes and specs are losing a majority of their self-sustain tools, so they're being nerfed in effectiveness. That will leave a niche for both Blood Death Knights and especially, from what I saw at BlizzCon at least, Vengeance Demon Hunters to continue to have incredible self-sustain at the cost of taking more damage up front. So there are trade-offs that come with that, but even in a world where Battle for Azeroth is out and self-sustain is nerfed, you'll still have some ability to keep yourself alive. Some sort of option, whether it's through a talent or a base ability, to maintain your life. Know what it is, know when to use it, and if you're a new tank and you have an option between an offensive DPS talent or a self-sustain or defensive talent, you should probably take the self-sustain or defensive talent. When you're first learning, it's way better to be more survivable and less worried about things like maximizing efficiency or DPS, and that becomes critical as you learn. You'll eventually find where your tolerance is, and you'll be able to take a more offensive build, which is the fun part about tanking. But early on, don't worry about doing maximum damage or DPS. Do the best job you can at surviving, because a dead tank is better, or a dead tank is worse than a low DPS tank. I have to charge my headset. Excuse me for a moment. Auto striking. All right. So moving right along after self-sustain, there's one other important thing to talk about with abilities, which is your oh shit buttons. Every tank spec has at least one, and it is very well worth knowing what they are and when to press them. An oh shit button is your last chance to pull out victory from the claws of defeat. Something is about to smash you in the face and kill you in one hit, but you have your oh shit button to grant you a second chance. Every tank spec has one, at least one. Some tank specs have multiple smaller oh shit buttons that can be synergized together, but it's important to know what they are. For myself as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, that button is Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is indicative of what it looks like when you have a massive oh shit button rather than a couple of small ones. It gives you multiple buffs. You get a demon form that increases your current and maximum health, so it effectively gives you free health and healing. It increases my armor, And it also empowers my shear ability. What it does specifically when it says it empowers my shear is that it makes it guarantee a soul fragment on hit. Currently, when you use it normally, it has a small chance to shatter a lesser soul fragment from an enemy, but it will become guaranteed when you're in Metamorphosis. So that's a very powerful buff. The other thing that it does is it also increases my pain generation by giving me 7 pain every second. This pain generation is huge for a Vengeance Demon Hunter because it increases your ability to do everything. You'll have more pain available for Demon Spikes. You'll have more pain available to Soul Cleave. You'll be able to Soul Cleave more often for a higher amount of healing. You can see how this adds up very quickly to give you just a massive amount of extra power when it's popped. It is a very short duration ability, so you only get 17.5 seconds with it, and that's empowered by all artifact traits. But 17.5 seconds is more than enough time for most fights to be quickly corrected if you screwed up something and need to fix it. Also, similarly, if your healer goes on vacay and suddenly doesn't heal you. Not as much of a problem for a Vengeance Demon Hunter, but it does happen. So in addition to oh shit buttons like that, there are also talents that need to be taken into consideration. Most tank classes these days have a choice of talents that varies between a self-sustain option, a defensive option, and a DPS option. What these serve the purpose of is allowing you to improve or change your tank gameplay for a different challenge. Most of the time when you're starting out, you're going to want to have a very, very basic survivability build. For example, as a Demon Hunter, my first tier is effectively mostly DPS increases, but there are things in here that improve my ability to deal with things defensively. Agonizing Flames, for example, makes it so Immolation Aura increases my movement speed. This can be great if you're trying to, get a big pull going and trying to mass up as many mobs as possible. It also allows you to move very quickly out of danger, so if you have a mobility situation, a debuff or a buff that you need to move into, it can give you a burst of speed that allows you to move right into that ability. Similarly, Abyssal Strike empowers your Infernal Strike ability so that the range it has is improved. That's my Tantrum Jump as a Demon Hunter. And then it also makes it so it has a reduced cooldown. So all around, it's an improvement to the use of that ability. And it's one that gives me a fair amount of power. Razor Spikes is pretty much purely damage, in that it also affects a melee snare on enemies that are hit by my physical damage abilities when I have Demon Spikes up. But it doesn't work on a lot of PvE mobs. It doesn't work on bosses, for example. It doesn't work on a lot of higher powered trash. So it can be defensively useful if it were to work on more things. But the fact that it doesn't work on a lot of the stuff we encounter in PvE means it's generally not worth it. To kind of go through a quicker set of examples, the same thing happens in our second tier, but on a much better scale. We have Feast of Souls, which is actually a survivability or self-sustained talent. We have Burning Alive, which is both a DPS talent and also can be a survivability talent, in that it spreads your Fiery Brand ability, which decreases the damage that is dealt by targets that have it on them. Fallout is both self-sustain and can also be a damage ability. It makes it so Immolation Aura's initial burst of damage has a chance to shatter lesser soul fragments from your targets. This benefits you defensively in that it gives you a self-sustain, so that you have a boost to your self-healing. It also benefits you offensively in that with full artifact traits, your Soul Cleave does damage based on the fragments it consumes, so it actually explodes and does an AoE damage burst. It also gives you more fragments for Spirit Bomb, which is a talent selection you can take. So your best bet is to look at a class guide on a site like Icy Veins or Wowhead, and to figure out the best talents that you want to select, prioritizing whatever you're most nervous about at that point. For any rookie tank, I definitely recommend looking at their starter build or whatever they'll recommend as a survivability or defensive build. These are the builds that give you the greatest amount of survival utility and the ones that make learning how to tank the easiest. The build I'm playing right now is actually a hybrid, and one of the cool things that you can get to when you start overcoming your Tanxiety, which is that you can actually become a pretty significant damage contributor in most groups. I can currently burst to about 900k DPS as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. Some of that's due to the unique setup of my class, just being super powerful and beastly, but some of that is based on talent selection. If I look back at my talents here for a second, you'll notice I have some talents like Flame Crash, Fracture, and Spirit Bomb. These are talents that give me options for sustained additional DPS. Flame Crash allows my Infernal Strikes to do way more damage by placing a Sigil of Flame, which also in a roundabout way affects my survivability by giving me increased healing from the Charred Warblade's artifact trait, which heals me on fire damage dealt. So you can see how there's this option for weird intermingled gameplay, where as a tank, you're going to prioritize survivability for the most part, but at a certain point, survivability and damage dealt can actually become a very intertwined set of goals. They certainly are for me, at least as a Demon Hunter. But the other part to Tanxiety is something we touched on earlier, and something I'm going to really come back to now, which is that oftentimes what keeps people from tanking isn't that they're worried about the role itself. They might be excited about tanking. And if you're watching this with Tanxiety, you might be very excited about tanking, which is great. The problem that a lot of people have is that tanks in pugs are generally expected to be leaders. They're expected to know the routes through the dungeon. They're expected to push everyone to do their best and to push everyone through the dungeon. So they'll often be the first ones looked at when something goes wrong, and the first ones blamed in hasty chat messages when shit hits the fan. It's easy and in vogue to kind of say that you should just have thick skin and deal with it. But one of the things that I recommend for pugs in particular is learning how to be a silent leader. The biggest component of being a leader as a tank isn't that you tell people what to do, it's that you show them what to do. The best way that you can do this is through solid gameplay. If you can take all of the mobs in a dungeon and round them up together and push them into a nice neat little death ball, and I'm gonna die. Oh wait, I get pulled back up. There we go. Anyways, now that diversion's over. So yeah, like gameplay actually is one of the easiest ways you can lead a group indirectly. You don't have to say anything as long as you play in a way that says everything you need to. What I mean by that is, as a tank, you have a tremendous amount of ability to affect how the group does things. You can pull a certain number of mobs. You can pull them in a certain way that indicates that you're not going to be pulling anymore, that you have what you want until the next pull. You can round them up in a way that makes it easier for your melee DPS to get to them. I'm a strong advocate for what Preach has called death balls. When you pull trash in a dungeon, you should be rounding it up to the nicest, most compact form you can so that AoE abilities will always hit all of the targets. And you should be doing one better than that. You should be positioning the mobs such that if you have melee in your group, that the back of the mobs is easily accessible for your melee with minimum movement. And you should also be looking out for additional patrols or other enemies that might get in the way, and making sure that your positioning ensures that they won't. You may not be able to guarantee that with any sort of certainty, but you can, in most cases, do a reasonably good job of getting everything balled up and incapable of beating the crap out of you, or sneaking up on you with a surprising addition to the team. So death balls and positioning are both key. Knowing your abilities comes full circle here. The easiest way to lead through solid gameplay is to be very capable of using your survival abilities to maximum benefit. Knowing when to pop your active mitigation, knowing when to pop your oh shit buttons, knowing when to pop any additional damage reductions you receive. Like, for example, as a Demon Hunter, I get Empower Wards to reduce magic damage until Battle for Azeroth. If I know I'm about to take some damage, I should pop that and use it to reduce magic damage taken and to make sure that my healer is doing well. But most important, and the biggest thing I want to relate about Tanxiety to all of those points, is that you should know your limits. it's okay to test them early on. Oftentimes, if you're doing like a level up dungeon or something, you're not really going to be challenged in a way that's not recoverable, especially if you have like a really good clutch healer with you. So it's okay to pull a little bit aggressively. It's okay to pull a little bit slowly. What you want to do is find the pace that fits you best. Pull as much or as little as you need to, and test those limits regularly so you know where they lie. Don't let yourself slow down unnecessarily because you're worried about pulling too much. Pull a little bit more than you're comfortable with at first and see how it goes. Pull a little bit less if you find that that was an uncomfortable and scary experience. Just keep experimenting, keep trying things, know where your limit is, and test that assumption regularly because it will change. When I started tanking in the tail end of Warlords of Draenor as a Brewmaster monk, it was scary to pull a lot of trash. I often would pull one pack at a time exactly as designed in the dungeon corridor with nothing else in there. And that was okay, but it wasn't very fun. It was easy and predictable, but what I found is that pretty quickly at lower levels of gear than I would have expected, I often was able to pull more stuff. More stuff and quicker than I would have expected. Just because I tried one time. I just had to, you know, take a look at it and see if I could actually pull a larger number of mobs than I had expected. And the answer was yes, and that was a really fun moment for me to realize that I was, you know, able to better play to my potential. You should always be looking for what your potential is, because that's the best way for you to get into more groups and to have more fun when you're tanking. It's fun to be the tank that can do crazy shit like solo or mythic dungeon, or to pull all of the trash from the beginning of the dungeon up to the first boss. These are fun things that groups really latch onto and will remember about you even if they don't remember your name or what class you played. Everyone has the story of the amazing hero tank, and that tank can be you if you learn your limits and learn to test them with regularity. Outside of that though, just have fun. I know it's hard to be a tank. It sucks, and a lot of times you're not going to get the thanks that you feel like you deserve, but tanking is very fun. And outside of just the fun of it, tanking is one of the few roles in the game that can really heavily impact the outcome of a dungeon or raid run. Very few other classes get to say that they manage to influence the entire dungeon by doing one thing differently. You get to do that as a tank, and you get to do that regularly as a tank. So embrace that. That's what's fun about being a tank. You're a single player that, with strong, focused gameplay, can do amazing, incredible things. Early on, you're going to feel anxious, and you're going to be worried about your performance in a dungeon, and that's okay. That's normal. What you'll start to feel eventually is that you feel confident in your performance, and that's the best feeling. Not only that, but early on, you'll start to realize, like everybody, that a dungeon is short. It's a very small amount of time taken. And so, sooner or later, that dungeon's over. Faster than you would expect. And when that dungeon ends, you'll have a sense of accomplishment from having tanked it that you wouldn't have had if you queued and waited 30 minutes to an hour to do it as a DPS. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I queue as Havoc all the time. But anyways, that's it for this video. If you liked it, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to be doing YouTube videos 7 days a week. Also, I'll be streaming 6 nights a week on Twitch over at twitch.tv/Kaylriene. And lastly, if you'd like to read my thoughts in written form, I have a blog at kaylriene.wordpress.com. So make sure to check that out, and I will see you all next time.
Thank you.